Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Really happy to see you all. Also want to welcome our guests that are not only here with us in this space, but in real time, joining us through our live feed and through our Zoom. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate your time. I hope you really enjoy this evening's talk. It's going to be an incredible evening, promise. So my name is Greg Hull. I'm the Dean of the Herron School of Art and Design. Again, really grateful that you're here with us this evening and looking forward to this evening's talk. Before we move forward, I would like to take a moment just to acknowledge that we're gathered here this evening on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Miami, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and Lenape people, and other Native peoples of the past and present. We also want to acknowledge the IUPUI displaced the African-American business and residential communities along Indiana Avenue and Ransom Place in the 1960s. We honor those who have cared for this place in the past, and we hope sincerely that its current use for the pursuit and sharing of knowledge and understanding, which are goals of the university, will lead to a future that is more equitable and just. Okay, before we begin this evening's talk, I want to take a quick moment just to thank everyone for being here and the many patrons and friends of Herron. So our great thanks to you. I'd also like to share that complimentary parking this evening is made possible by the Great Frame Up of Indianapolis and Carmel. And we'll talk more briefly about how we take care of your parking, but really excited that we can provide that resource. But now it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Herron's Gallery Director and Curator, Paula Katz. Welcome, Paula.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for being here. Before I introduce Sam Van Aken, I wanted to remind everyone that next Wednesday, September 20th, we will open 3 exhibitions. That evening, we will begin with a talk by artist Andrea Myers at 6 p.m. And immediately following the talk, we'll open her exhibition Materialize in the Berkshire, Reese, and Paul galleries, Queer Icons in the Marsh, and in the Basile Gallery, we'll have a select group of films from the 2003 an anthology of moving images, including films by Francis Elise, Henri Sala, and Joan Jonas. So I hope you can all join us next week as well. And I also want to encourage you all to attend our workshop tomorrow with Sam Van Aken at Aspire House. That'll be at 12:30 p.m. And that is at 1002 Udall Street, which I hope I'm pronouncing right. So please Google that and check it before you try to do that from how I just pronounced that. I also want to say a special thank you to Executive Director Sharon Clark of Aspire House for her willingness to partner on this event. And I don't know if he's here, but I also want to thank Elias, who is the gallery manager here, for all the work he's done to also help facilitate this visit as well. And that brings me to the reason we're all here tonight, which is actually to welcome Sam Van Aken. And I'm so appreciative that he's here. This has been a discussion, I think, a long time in the making and getting him here. So just thrilled to introduce him. So Sam Van Aken's artwork bridges traditional and innovative modes of art making, developing artistic genres to create new perspectives on such themes as agriculture, botany, climatology, and communication. Van Aken's interventions in the natural and public realm are seen as metaphors that serve as the basis for narrative, sites of placemaking, and in some cases have even become the basis of scientific research. Van Aken studied art and communication theory in undergraduate school and received an MFA from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has exhibited both nationally and internationally and received numerous honors, including a Joan Mitchell, I was about to say Joan Jonas again. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm super rusty. A Joan Mitchell Foundation Award, Association of International Curators Award for Excellence, and a Creative Capital Grant. Recently, his work has been presented as part of Nature, Cooper Hewitt's Design Triennial, the World Economic Forum, and New Earthworks exhibition at Arizona State University this past spring. I couldn't be more excited to also share that this November, he will be part of a team consisting of Herron School and Art and Design alum, Samuel Levi Jones, and law office out of Columbus, Indiana, that will have their project featured in the Chicago Architecture Biennial, which opens this November. Currently, he is the Associate Director of the School of Art and Associate Professor at Syracuse University. And will you all please join me in welcoming Sam Van Aken?
Okay, it is great to be here, mostly because I teach at Syracuse University and there are 2 Herron alum that are currently in our grad program. And it got me a little extra street cred when they saw it on Instagram that I would be speaking here. So they both mentioned it to me in class. Yeah, just this week. Yeah, it's funny. I try to come up with titles for my talks, and like kind of the 2 things I came up with is how things got this way or mistakes were made. So I tend to when I'm talking at art schools, I start way back, so that you can see that the work wasn't always like highlight real stuff. That it's like it comes at the end of a longer journey. So to that end, here we go. I always start here because this is where I grew up. I grew up on a dairy farm in Pennsylvania. And my family milked 200, something like 200 cows a day. And for those of you that don't know, dairy farming is the worst. It's like the worst thing on earth, right? You get up at 4:30 and you milk cows for 3 hours before you go to school, and then you come back from school and do it again. And so I think as a child, I was like, what is the thing that is the farthest from farming? And I thought that was art. So I had a very unconventional start to art making. This is my college ceramics professor, who has never, I've known this man for longer than I'd like to admit. He never taught me how to throw a pot. But he did some other amazing things. He would offer students these wonderful opportunities like, hey, do you want to go to Europe for spring break? And then you find out you're driving ambulances during the Bosnian War. But he was very tied to Eastern Europe. And so he introduced me to artists in Eastern Europe that were considered they were avant-garde. They were outside of the communist system, right? And these unofficial artists would make artwork in living rooms, in bedrooms, in abandoned buildings, and they would risk jail time, right, under the communist regime. And it was like taking away your passport, and they would do these Stalinistic tactics like fire your family from their jobs. And one of the things that in meeting these artists, that professor actually helped me go to live and work with these artists in Poland for the better part of a year. And it really changed the stakes of what art was, right? If the government's trying to keep these unofficial and unaccepted artists from making art, that means art's really important. I think the other thing that I learned from them is working with everyday materials. So when I came back, I started working with what's around me, right? And so that's objects, but then it's also media. I was thinking about how much, just like how much of my life was shaped by media at the time. So this piece is entitled "The Multiple Deaths of Willem Dafoe." And so what it is it's this funerary setting for Willem Dafoe's deaths, who at the time of the making of the piece had the most deaths on screen. And in fact, the majority of his films ended with him dying rather than finishing it through to the end, which is a career trajectory that hasn't changed. And for a little while, we were email friends, which I thought was like the coolest thing in the world, until a friend encouraged me to send one of those floral arrangements to him, and I sent it to his house, and then I never heard from him again. I was like, I guess I crossed the line, Yeah, so it's a detail of it. I was really, there we go. Yeah, at the time, I was also doing a lot of audio work. So this piece is entitled "Oh My God." This is a 8-foot tall by 50-foot long wall of stacked speakers. And these are all home stereo speakers that I've sourced. And you can kind of see how it's propped up here. That's the wiring that goes into the back of it. And it's all controlled by this computer system. So on this computer is an algorithm that selects from a database of 600 clips that I've taken from television, from movies, and people saying, oh my God. It randomly selects from this database and then randomly sends it out to one of these, I think it was close to 500 speakers. And the piece is built on it's about a 6.5 minute sort of trajectory. And so what happens at like about 6 minutes is like, or when it starts, you'll hear people saying, oh my God, and you hear somebody else say, oh my God, and then, oh my God, oh my God. It builds up until all the speakers are shouting at you. And then it cuts out and there's a reverberation that takes place through the room where you continue to hear it throughout it. And I was thinking about, that one word and how it gets used in so many different ways. I'm gonna figure out this clicker. There we go. At the same time, I was doing a lot of media-based work. I was also working with plants. So my grandfather, great-grandfather, actually made his living grafting fruit trees, right? And so growing up in an agricultural community, like farmers tend to be people that are very resourceful. They if it's broken, you learn how to fix it. And so they're not very impressed by technical skills. But I do remember, like, I had never met my great-grandfather, but everybody that spoke about him said he knew how to graft. Like it was this magical or mystical thing. So I had done a lot of work with grafting. Like I did this piece sticking together all these pieces of plastic fruit, which just really came out really sexual. And I was like, that's kind of cool, but let's try to make this real. And so I grafted an entire garden onto one root system. Right. So, and they're primarily like nightshade plants. And the problem with that piece is it only lasts one growing season. And I was like, oh man, I'm not really like set on having longevity of my work, but longer than 6 months is probably a good thing. All right, do this. Okay, here's some details. Okay, so I showed this piece because it was kind of pivotal into some of the later work. So I became really infatuated with Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast, right? So I'm driving to New York City and I'm like passing through New Jersey and I see a sign for Grover's Mills, right? And Grover's Mills is the town that was the basis of Welles's radio hoax. So I think it was like 1938. Welles sort of takes over this radio station and does this whole hoax about how aliens have landed in this small town of Grover's Mills, New Jersey. And it's like, it caused widespread panic. It led to the development of this institution called the FCC, the Federal Communication Commission. And the thing that I thought is like how nothing physically happened in that day, right? But for so many people, it changed their reality, right? They got into their cars, they started driving to Ohio, and didn't realize it to the end. So in driving through Grover's Mills, I found out that there was a Mr. Grover's home. And then on the night of the broadcast, on the left-hand side, the good citizens of Grover's Mills decided to go out and hunt for the aliens with guns. And they mistook this standpipe that was in the backyard of Mr. Grover's home and began to shoot holes in it, right? And I asked the current owner if I could take some photographs. He said, you're so nice. Somebody slipped on my pool cover and is suing me now. I would just like to get rid of the thing. And I was like, I'll take it off your hands, right? And so I assumed that they sort of went after this standpipe because it looked like what Welles was describing in the broadcast. And then I started to use it as a broadcasting antenna. So this is at Hallwall's Gallery in Buffalo, New York. So I tilted it on its side and I set up a sound stage and started broadcasting this hoax about how there was like acid rain that was taking the paint off cars, but don't worry, it's okay for humans. And the thing that I was doing though is that I was using, you can see a little broadcasting unit in the back. I was hijacking commercial radio stations to do this. And I found out how quickly they shut you down. So that was a very, very short exhibition. But the thing that I kept being interested in is how that one form, it was a windmill at one point. It was a standpipe that would collect water to create indoor plumbing for Mr. Grover's home. The night of the hoax, it was an alien ship, and then I was turning it into a tower. And so I realized that doing hoaxes probably wasn't a good career trajectory for me. I went back to hoax, and I found out that the term hoax comes from hocus pocus, which is believed to come from a line in the Catholic Eucharist. It's when the priest says hoc est enim corpus meum over the bread. And for Catholics, that's transubstantiation. It's no longer a piece of bread, it is actually the body of Christ, right? And the thing I kept coming back to is the appearance of the thing remains the same while its reality changes. And so I started thinking about, like, what could I make that is like that tower, right? What's like that piece of bread? And I developed a project called the Tree of 40 Fruit. So the Tree of 40 Fruit is a single tree. There grows 40 different varieties of stone fruit. So that's peaches, plums, apricots, nectarines, cherries, almonds, growing all on one tree. And it's made to look relatively like a normal looking fruit tree throughout the majority of the year. And then in spring, when it blossoms in all of these different colors and then bears all this different fruit, it reveals itself. So I went back and even though I hadn't met my great grandfather, I decided to learn how to graft trees. And so it's a pretty simple process. You take clippings from trees in the middle of winter, and then you graft in spring as the trees start to break dormancy. Yeah. So when I started out, the interesting thing is that I live in upstate New York, and I could not find 40 different varieties of stone fruit. And 100 years ago, New York was the second leading producer of those fruits, right? And I realized the extent to which industrialization of agriculture and also monocultures took over, right? So New York, the larger fruit producing industry is apples. And anywhere you could plant an apple tree, they planted apples because it's easier to get to wholesalers and distributors. And so we built this whole economic system on it. And meanwhile, the stone fruit had pretty much disappeared. So as I would go and find them at farms, at research institutions that were closing their programs, I would collect them and bring them back onto the trees that I had in my nursery. And so to start the Tree of 40 Fruit, what I do is I take a small 6-inch branch, graft it onto a new root system or root structure, grow the tree out for about 3 years, at which point I head it off, right? I cut out the central leader that exists in the middle of the tree, and then it starts to form a vase shape. And this is what they look like when they're planted at about 4 or 5 years old. I tend to plant them with about 12 varieties grafted to them. And then this is what they'll look like another 4 years later as they get acclimated to the soil and start to grow out. Here's a detail of the blossoms. And so each tree has its own diagram, and the colors of the diagram are largely based on what year the grafting was done. One of the things that I found is that each of the varieties of stone fruit has its own blossom. So it's very unique blossom. It'll have its own unique color, and it has a slightly different blossoming time. So that by creating this sort of like massive Excel spreadsheet, I created this timeline of when the varieties would blossom in relationship to each other, so I could design how the tree blossoms each spring. And a lot of that was, by mistake, because I had this one tree that blossomed on one side and looked dead on the other, and I was like, yeah, that was not ideal. And so this is what they look like as they fruit. And then here's I have to update this map. There's quite a few more. There's about 41 trees in 25 locations throughout the US at this point. And then there's a few projects in Europe and Sweden, Switzerland, and some places like that. And what I do now with the project is that it really started as an aesthetic object, right? But then as the project evolved, it really became about going to different locations, researching what varieties were grown in that area, working with farmers, collecting the varieties and grafting them on the tree so it becomes an agricultural history of that area, of the area, and then might be the thing that preserves those varieties, as more and more of this industry continues to go and to fade. So I thought the Tree of 40 Fruit project was like a 3-year project. And I was like, cool, you know, it's like my typical art project. Might take a few years to develop. I get it out and I'm done with it. And so I had shifted over to working with the weather. One of the things that happened when I first started the Tree of 40 Fruit was that in 2012, the USDA changed the grow zones for the country, right? And you know, so if you're interested in planting things in your yard or you're a farmer, you research what your grow zone is, and that tells you the list of plants that'll perform well within your region. What happened in 2012 is that shifted. It was like all of these grow zones just shifted slightly north, right? And it also meant that our weather shifted 5 degrees, right? And I was shocked that nobody talked about that. Like nobody had said, you know, it wasn't anything that was published in the New York Times or any news site. And then also I became more interested in how the weather was starting to become more erratic. We were starting to have more and more weeks in January that were like in the 70s and 80s, right? And trees would start to blossom early. And so that led me to think about like rainmaking, like how we control, you know, which I think is eventually going to become a reality where we're going to have to think about ways of changing the weather in order to survive. So, and I started to look at like weather modification and rainmaking, both sort of like in ritualistic practices, but also in ways that are already being manipulated, where they'll drop silver iodide into clouds over ski resorts to make it snow in Colorado. So my first couple forays into this, so this was an exhibition that was in Utica, New York. This is at the Munson Williams Proctor Art Museum, and the piece is entitled Acadia. So for the piece, I went to Acadia National Park in Maine. Acadia was once known as Eden because it was so beautiful. I decided, yeah, I'm gonna compress all of this air and move it back against weather currents and inflate these weather balloons. So these are all like 10-foot weather balloons that are filled with the air of Acadia. And the idea is that it would change the atmosphere of the museum. And what happens over the course of the 3-month exhibition is that these balloons deflate, the air goes out into the museum, and the exhibition just disappears entirely by the end of it. Then I also came across these known as fall streak holes. So these started to appear on the internet, you know, in like late 2000s, like 2008, 2009, and everybody thought that they were aliens or Russians. And I was like, that might not be the case. So I started to look into it, and these are occurring about 30 to 40 miles from airports. And I kind of deduced that they were being produced by planes as they're flying through a very specific cloud pattern. And that cloud pattern is altocumulus clouds. So these are cloud patterns that will appear 6 to 12 hours before the weather changes. And from that, I learned how to tell the weather. It's interesting, all of our weather, so all the weather forecasts are based on the fact that around the world at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, 11,000 weather balloons are launched into the air. And they measure temperature, humidity, wind speed, and they broadcast that information back, and that's what all the weather models are based on. And what they do so that you can tell what the weather is they create these skew T diagrams that trace the trail of the balloon as it drifts up into the atmosphere. So I learned how to tell weather from these skew T diagrams. Then I got a pilot. And when I got the right weather conditions, I would call my pilot and I'd be like, let's do it. And so we'd jump in a plane and we would fly around Syracuse, putting holes in clouds like that. Which became like really expensive. Like when, you know, in retrospect, I was like, I'm hustling trees to put holes in clouds. I was like, what has my life become? And then the project took like a really great turn because, you know, I would give talks about my work and people would learn about this project. And then what they would do is, oh, we're gonna skip that. What they would do then is when they would see them, they would take pictures with their phone and send them to me and be like, hey, are you in Michigan? Like, or are you in upstate New York? And then when I had friends in Ireland that were showing them to me, I was like, this is getting to be too much. So yeah, I had completely shifted gears away from working with trees. And then this started to happen. The tree of 40 fruit became a meme. So it was like floating around the internet. It was really strange. And then like this. So the and then like yeah, Kanye started posting. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, Ye started posting about it, which was really weird. He would like get these massive batch of like Rococo and Baroque artworks and like put them and then put the tree of 40 fruit in the middle and then more Rococo and Baroque works. And that was it. Nothing ever said. I was like, I don't know. This is about. Okay, so then this like, you know, of course, so much of media is determined by social media. It's weird if something starts to get picked up on through social media platforms, news agencies start to contact you. That's a whole other thing, which leads to like crazy opportunities. So like at the World Economic Forum, I'm talking about grafting fruit trees with Peter Gabriel. And then this is for the younger crowd, will.i.am is like, hey, let's do this with citrus in Florida. But probably the most terrifying part of all of this was that when the project was first picked up online, NPR contacts me, and I was like, "This is a dream. I'm a college professor. This is like hitting pay dirt, right?" So I was on Weekend Edition one Saturday, so I'm talking about the tree of 40 fruit, and we're joking around and having fun, and that following Monday, I get a call from the USDA that is like, what the hell are you doing? And then I get a call from DARPA that's like, hey, what the hell are you doing? And so for those of you that don't know, DARPA is Defense Advanced Research Project Administration. It's part of the Department of Defense. They develop things like the internet, like the NASA, other things. So the DA was concerned that I was an individual collecting all of these different varieties. Even though I had been placing the trees at museums, they said that I was a commercial grower and that I needed a commercial grower's license, had to do all these things. DARPA was like, well, food scarcity is a national security threat because now that we've narrowed the number of varieties that we grow down to a very few, if something happens to one of them, it threatens the entire food system. So look up the Cavendish banana. It's a fascinating story. It made me look at this collection of fruit that I had a lot differently, right? I was told by the USDA that I had one of the largest collections of stone fruit in the country, and perhaps had the largest collection of them in the Eastern United States, which I thought, that is nuts because I'm a hack and that should not happen. And my growing skills were not that good. So to give you an idea, these are plums collected from just one tree of 40 fruit in 1 week in August, right? So there's plums, there's Mirabelle plums that come from France from like 600 years ago. There's damson plums that are 2,000 years old, and its name is derived from Damascus, where they originated. They traveled through Europe, you know, over a 2,000-year period, and eventually show up on the American continent. So they freaked me out, right? I'm like, what is all of this? And so, not being all that confident in my growing capabilities at the time, I thought, how am I going to preserve these varieties? Right? Because I was also told I had some of the last extant varieties, like they were the last ones, right? And if they die, that's it. So I started preserving them any way I knew how, and that was through art. And so that was like going into orchards and taking out like the bowl sections, which include the first grafting union. I was making pressings of each of the branches and each of the flowers so that I could preserve some of the genetic material. I got a 19th century book press, which is this like one of my like prized possessions, you know. That those pressings eventually evolved into an herbarium. So I created my own herbarium of these press branches. And so this is from a exhibition called Seeds of Resistance at Michigan State University. So this is what the pressings, the individual pressings look like. These are actual voucher specimens. So these are scientific specimens that are created. And from them, I was pressing a button that isn't Jason. Okay, I did something right. There we go. Okay, from those pressings, I also found out that some of the first cyanotypes were produced by Anna Atkins as scientific specimens. I started to also do weird things, like there's this Chinese ritual where you go out and if you collect peach branches in the middle of a solar eclipse, hang them by a red thread, soak them in salt water until the next new moon, you create magic wands, right? Because peach branch from that year's growth is actually known as a wand. And so I started like a little bit of a side trade, you know, on my artwork where I'm like, this isn't artwork, this is mysticism I'm dealing in now. Creating peach strands from all the peach pits. So the thing I realized though is that, you know, in order to actually preserve these fruit, I have to get them out in front of people, right? And they've got to taste them because the taste is a lot different. In the past 100 years, what we've done is we've essentially bred the nutritional value and taste out of fruit and replace it with sugars, right? So that when you bite into a piece of fruit now, it's more like a candy bar than it is a piece of fruit, right? And so I was like, okay, I have to get these fruit out. And so I came up with this idea that what I was going to do is I was going to plant an orchard in the middle of New York City, right? And I was like, this is how I'm going to do it, right? I'm going to get it in the largest population of people that I know. And I went around to all of these art collectors I knew, all of these like, funders, people that'll fund large projects in New York. And they kind of like patted me on the head and said, you're so cute. And I was like, man, this is never going to happen. So I was like looking further and further up the Hudson Valley. And it wasn't until I was approached by Governor's Island in New York Harbor that the project really became feasible. So Governor's Island is a former naval base, it's gone through a couple of different, sort of military iterations. And then in 2000, it was given to the city of New York. And they've developed a public art program for the island. And they said, we would like to host your orchard. So, which was amazing, right? And I got that acre of land. So in 2018, we started planting out all of the trees. And then through 2019 and then through the pandemic, we grew them out in a nursery, which it's weird to actually do farming with the World Trade Center behind you. Also really weird because like the Trump kids would fly over like Governor's Island, like that was weird. Like in those big Osprey helicopters and like shut down like the FDR Drive just to get to their condos. But anyway, so these are cherries. And so these are apricots. That's a weird segue from Trump to cherry trees. And so you can see how the trees start to continue to grow out. This is the site map for Governor's Island. And then one of the things that we had to do is because it's definitely a constructed space. So Governor's Island was actually a much smaller island until they built the 1, 2, 3, and 4 trains in New York. What they did is they excavated and tunneled out all the soil and they just dumped it on the end of Governor's Island and made the island twice as big, right? So it's not the most ideal growing soil. They say good growing soil takes 10,000 years to develop. Since that wasn't going to happen, we had to go through and excavate each of these, each of the tree pits. The orchard is 102 trees. They're all multi-grafted, so they each grow at least 4 different varieties on them. And so this was the initial planting for it. And then this is what it looked like, actually, I think last spring. So all of the varieties either originated in, were historically grown, or indigenous to New York City, right? And it's very strange. New York City is the home of fruit tree growing in the country, right? Because throughout, like, even up until the 18th century, fresh fruit was grown either for cider making. People would grow apples to make cider, or they would grow peaches to feed livestock. And the peach did so well in the southern part of the US that it was actually an invasive species, like one of the first invasive species in the country. And it wasn't until French immigrants displaced by the Edict of Nantes arrived in Flushing, Queens, that they brought grafting with them. And then it started this whole craze for this cultivated fruit varieties. So people started going out and trying to find all of these different varieties and then graft them and grow them. And so there's roughly about 250 varieties that are contained within the orchard. And the orchard is organized on an east-west axis. So every other row is apple trees. And the reason for that is that the lifespan of a stone fruit tree is roughly 60 to 70 years, while apples will last 200 years. So these rows that are in the middle will die out and the apples will just continue to grow and create arches over them. And as you can see, the views aren't too bad. So it's, it's nice to have, like, look down a row and see the Statue of Liberty. This is one of my favorite views because this is Ellis Island that you can see on the other side of the Hudson. A lot of these varieties were actually brought by immigrants as the last connection to their home. These are people that came to the United States knowing they would never go home again, and they would bring a seed or a sapling tree with them and grow it, and that was the way that they remembered home. So in addition to the 102 trees that currently are on Governor's Island, there's also an expansive orchard that takes place across all of New York City. So working with Green Thumb, a part of New York City parks, we've placed these trees back into the neighborhoods in which they originated. So perhaps the most famous apple coming out of New York is the green Newtown Pippin, and we place that back in Newtown, or what is today Elmhurst, Queens. And somebody told me that it might be the largest public art project in New York through all of the community gardens that it's gone out to. So in addition to, one of the things that I've, it seems like I'll be working on these projects and its meaning and significance changes for me as it continues. And one of the things that really started to evolve from the orchard is this idea that, yes, these are fruit trees, but they're actually more a vehicle for workshops for me at this point, right? Because you're dealing with an urban community. And these are people that a lot of times have no idea how to grow anything, right? And I mean, you look at our education system now. It's like a lot of, even if you grow up in a rural area, they're not teaching you how to plant seeds or do any type of agriculture in school. And I started to think of even these workshops starting to become metaphorical, and it's not about growing things. It's just like learning how to care for things, or care for things in a different way. So a lot of now I'm like the workshop guy that travels all around, obviously, to Indiana now to do these workshops. Other parts of the project are that we have fresh eating tours on the island. And then I'm partnering with local chefs in New York to recreate specific recipes that evolved around these dishes. So a lot of these fruit are 600-700 years old. And they had very specific dishes, and so been recreating them through the project as well. So one of the things, we did our first tree distribution last spring, right, to go out to the community garden. So there's this enormous dump truck that showed up out on Governor's Island, and I loaded it with like 60 trees, and these all went out to the community gardens. And one of the things that was really interesting is that people started to send me photos, like as they were planting the trees. And then they were emailing me these photos, and it was amazing to see that smile on their faces. And it honestly, I think that tree distribution, like if I have to look at it, like I think one of the things that you do as an artist is like you look for validation, right? And so, you know, everybody says like getting your art gallery is like that moment of validation, or maybe your first solo museum show. I think this was the most validating thing that I've done so far. So in addition to the orchard itself, the other thing that I'm currently working on is a series of botanical prints. So what I've been doing is taking all of the historical botanical prints that are for each of these, that have been done for each of these varieties. And then I use CNC machines to actually do some of the etching. Then I'll go back in with hand working so that it becomes this almost like a palimpsest, like all of the appearances, all of the accidents that occurred in the moment of the history of these fruit, and then compiling these histories. Like a lot of the varieties don't have complete histories to them. So going back in and doing the history of it. And then also the other thing that's become a part of it is actually genetically sequencing the varieties, having it be part of the print. And so the originally botanical prints were sold as a subscription service. So you would sign up for this subscription service and you would receive a print a month, and then you put it into a portfolio, and eventually you would bound it. So we started as a started this as a subscription service. Yeah. And then yeah, I'm doing like a limited number that are hand colored. So this is kind of my favorite view from the orchard. So there isn't anything at the end. There's no Statue of Liberty. There's no World Trade Center. Like when I go back to the orchard a lot because it needs a lot of work. I'll stand at the bottom of this hill and I'll look up, and it almost seems like the trees go forever. Yeah, so that's, you know, there's something kind of rewarding in that. Do I have time for one more? Yeah, we'll do these real quick. Okay, so I became really interested. Well, I was approached by a Japanese ag biotech firm that said they found the universal grafting plant, right? So they've identified a plant that you can use to graft between two different species of plant. Now, typically grafting is limited to a very specific genus, right? So for stone fruit, it's prunus, right? So as long as it's in the prunus genus, you can graft it together. For apples, if it's in malus, you can graft it together. But you cannot take apples and graft them to stone fruit, right? It remains limited, but they said they found this way to, that you could graft between apples and stone fruit. And so I started working with them, and then we're still currently working on this project where we're trying to use this universal grafting plant, which I don't know if I can talk about, but I'll tell you. It's Nicotiana, right? So it's actually like a strain of tobacco that you can use as an interstock variety as a grafter. And we're like, oh, okay. As the project developed, I was working on a project in Dubai, and I said, well, what if we take this universal grafter, we put it on desert plants, which have these deep tap roots that go into aquifers, and then you put vegetables on top, right? And you can, so we started the first trials for these several years ago, and it's still kind of like in development right now. We'll skip that. This was the artist rendering for the project. This does not exist. But I will talk about this piece because this project is currently in development, and it's been like what I've been focused on for 3 weeks. Yeah, I'm working with an advertising firm in Dubai right now to create a piece that commemorates the Abraham Accords of year 2000. And so what we're doing is we're taking a citrus tree from Israel, a citrus tree from the United Arab Emirates, and connecting their branches together. And we're proposing it as part of the COP28 climate summit that's going to be in Dubai at the end of November. The other thing that we're going to do is actually do a selective breeding program. So taking pollen from one tree, grafting it into the blossoms of another tree, letting that fruit, taking those seeds, planting those, growing those for 3 years, and selecting the best of those varieties, actually making the first citrus tree that's developed in the United Arab Emirates. And I was writing that proposal 2 hours ago. So I feel like we're up to date now. Thank you. Thanks. Covered it all, huh? This is like a lot like my teaching. I'm a really good teacher. There's no questions. Depends on who's asking. Are you part of the government? If you're part of the government, I have not. Not much, but I've advised on that. Yeah. So yeah. Which so the tree of 40 fruit, it depends, right? Like it's if I plant trees in October in upstate New York, never have to water them again, right? It's the trees establish. I mean, you have some years that are droughts, where the trees struggle, but fruit trees, particularly stone fruit, they like stress. Like they produce better fruit when they're stressed. Otherwise, what happens with too much water, the fruit gets really big and doesn't taste like anything. Obviously, doing projects in California, you need watering. But for the most part, there's trees in New Harmony that don't need any watering. Yeah.
Gonna use the mic, so
Okay.
just to, because we're recording. So
Okay.
does
Great.
anyone else have a question?
My instructor had showed us a news video with you talking about the tree, and I remember you saying that for some people they viewed the tree with all the fruits in almost like a biblical type viewpoint. Do you have like a personal, like, does it represent something symbolic for you personally as its creator?
That's a good question. All right. So it's purposeful, right? The use of the number 40 is very much purposeful, and that I looking at Western religion, 40 is this number that it's not a dozen and it's not infinite, but it's a number that was a number that's supposed to indicate a bounty, right? And so from that, then that was used in the early US government as a way of making reparations. Like it fell into this like legal factor. And a lot of it was also reparations that were promised and never made, right? So for 40 acres and 40 acres and a mule was a promise to slaves. So it was very loaded, right? As to its religious implications, it's funny because they're probably once a year now, I have pastors and priests and rabbis, imams that have sent me like sermons that they've written using this as a metaphor. Although one of my students showed me a TikTok where somebody said it was sacrilegious too. So I don't, I think what it is it's purposefully ambiguous. Yeah.
Just to kind of piggyback a little bit off the first question, I'm really curious about how you think about taking care of your artist archive. Most of us don't have work that's actually alive. And so you mentioned a lifespan of like 60 to 200 years. So how do you consider planning and organizing to like keep these alive Or is that it like, is that part of the work too? And how does that figure in as a kind of like hidden component of creating the work?
Oh, yeah. I'm a little more laissez-faire than my studio manager is about this issue. Um, like it, I don't know. The way I should be more concerned about archiving than I am. I think a lot of that is more like a philosophy that if we look at like, we tend to think of museums as these like concrete things, right? And, you know, museums in the United States are only 150 years old, right? Some of my trees are gonna live longer than that, right? And now as museums are struggling to find attendees, you know, certain museums are struggling to find, who knows what's gonna happen with that. And so, yes, I'm very much invested in recording what I can. But then after I'm gone, what does it matter, right? You know, I guess like you know, there'll be the things that I've made, and then what happens with the trees. I mean, these varieties, you know, when you're grafting trees, you're taking part in this continuum, right? You know, if we take the seed from a fruit tree, it's a genetic variant of the parent. So if you plant it and grow it out, it's going to be different than the parent tree. So what we do is we use grafting to replicate these trees over and over. So the trees that are 2,000 years old, that means that every 20 to 30 years, somebody had to take a branch, stick it onto a new root system, and grow it out. And I like that idea of being part of that continuum more than being like the endpoint of it, right? And that hopefully, maybe someday, somebody will regraft those trees and preserve the varieties. So very confused answer. I don't know if I answered any of it, but yeah, that's my thoughts. All right, you have a Metallica t-shirt. That's fantastic.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering how pollinators factored in with your work, because I know some bees are better at pollinating orchards than compared to, let's say, honeybees. So I was wondering like how big of effect they have with your work.
Yeah, one of the things that's pretty great with the Tree of 40 Fruit is that the pollinators are so close. They don't have, like, the bees don't have to work as hard, right? Because they're just going from branch to branch. And so more often than not, I have a problem with the trees oversetting, right? So, you know, one of the owners of the trees will call me and be like, what should I do? And like the branches are weighed down and I'm, you know, so a lot of times it requires what they call thinning. So going in June and taking out pretty much half of the fruit. Yeah, so that's with multi-grafted trees. So even in the orchard, what I've done is, so say there's 4 varieties on a tree, they'll all be the same pollinator, or have the same blossoming time, so that they pollinate more readily and more quickly. Yeah, and you can get by, with less pollinators, sadly, right? And that's one thing that they're actually doing in orchards in California now. They'll take a pollinating variety and graft it into the top of a tree, because there is a reduced amount of pollinators. Or I order bees in a box, which is really cool. You get like bees and you open the door and the bees fly out, pollinate everything, you put it back in, send it off, get honey. Can't beat that.
Okay, so you mentioned workshops being kind of like an important part of your work now, and now you're the workshop guy. I'm kind of curious to hear what part of the workshop experience is so valuable to you? Is it the engagement? Is it the fact that now people can graft a food scarcity solution? Like what is it?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it, you know, in some ways, like, this is gonna say, God, I hope my university isn't listening to this. Like, it's like that to me is like almost like pure teaching, where it's this like, here's a skill set that that I want to give away, right? And it used to, like I growing up before the internet, right? It was always this thing where you there were gatekeepers, right? And there were people that held particular knowledge, right? And that depending on what it was always difficult to get that knowledge, right? And I like that idea that, you know, of everything becoming like open source in a way, right? The open orchard itself is based on a Lenape philosophy that can't own the sky, you can't own water, and things exist. And the weird term for it is called usufruct, right? In public, you know, in the public. So I think that's the part I find rewarding right now, you know, and also just the magic of it. Like, it's really weird. Like, you show people how to graft and they cut 2 pieces of wood and stick them together. And then they leave the workshop with their little potted plant. And like 4 months later, when that thing grows, it's like you turned them into a magician. Like, they think it's the greatest thing on earth. And there's something magical to it like that. Yeah.
I'm just curious about the timing of the grafting, because you had mentioned you have to cut it in the winter and then graft it in the spring. So how do you do the workshops year round, or do you only, because you're gonna do one tomorrow, I believe,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. So tomorrow, okay. So there's so generally what I'll do is I'll go out, collect the branches in dead of winter in January, and then I put them in a refrigerator. You try not to put them in a refrigerator with other food, right? Because certain foods can off gas and they can contaminate the grafting material. Then I usually have a window that starts the 2nd week in March and goes through the 2nd week in May. So it's like a 2-month window for doing like traditional grafting, like, you know, like I showed in the image. But then there's also a type of grafting that you can do called budding, where you take the tiny little sliver that contains a growth bud that exists at the bottom of the leaf petal, and cut and insert it into a branch. And you wait till that goes all winter to heal in. And then you prune the branch right above that bud graft and it just forms new growth. Yeah, so we're gonna do some of that. I'm gonna show like a couple different ways to how to graft tomorrow.
And just a reminder, that's 12:30 tomorrow at Aspire House. So very, very excited for that. I hope people can make it. I don't sound excited, but that's the flat tone you always get. Sam, do you have time for another question or two? Okay. Anybody else?
Oh, okay.
So I'm interested, you have this really intimate relationship with these plants, and I am curious over time now, if you've actually seen an impact, have we seen climate change and global warming? Are you gaining any insights?
Yeah.
Tree
Like,
whisperer.
probably the big thing right now is that so when the USDA changed the grow zones, one of the things that happened is that people were all of a sudden they were like, oh, we're going to be able to grow things like in New York, right? Everybody was like, oh, we'll be able to grow varieties that are mid-Atlantic, right? So all these landscapers came in and they planted all these mid-Atlantic varieties throughout New York that quickly suffered and perished. And so what happened, what I've found is that I actually have to grow varieties that are from a colder climate, right? So even varieties that are traditionally grown in Canada, because what's happening as the weather fluctuates, right? The trees are taking, the trees are starting to blossom too early, right? And you need those colder varieties from colder regions that take a long time to blossom. And so I think what's actually going to happen is it'll shift back down as things get warmer. But no, it's a blessing that I do not have to make my living off of fruit production. Like, it is, yeah, I mean, just watching the orchardists and farmers around me like struggle, like this year, again, it was like last summer was a drought. This summer it was a monsoon. And one of the things that happened with a lot of the apple producers in New York is like the apples got like this big, but then you bite into them and they don't taste like anything because they're so, they've absorbed so much water. So it's yeah, thank God I don't have to make a living off that. All the way over there. And you work for it.
So if we're unable to make it to your workshop tomorrow, is there like a schedule of workshops that are in the area that we could have access to? And where could we like find a schedule for that?
Okay. Depends on what area means. I'm doing one in New York City next week. No, I'm just kidding. There's actually a bunch of videos posted on the Green Thumb website. I think it's called the Open Orchard School. But I go through grafting, planting trees, all of that. Yeah, so you can find it online. Okay, I almost got it. No, I'm kidding. No, go ahead. Okay.
I'm just curious about with all the varieties that you're using and their resistance to like blight, pest, disease. Like, do you find that these older varieties are hardier than the ones that we have now? And in combining them, does it increase their disease resistance? And on the East Coast, how do they stand up to your oh, what's the beauty bug that's killing everything? The red one. Oh, the
Spotted
spotted lantern fly. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
how do they stand up to things like
Okay.
this?
Whew, okay, there's a lot there, but that's good. So traditionally, I've been told that older varieties are harder to grow. Like that's sort of like the common knowledge that people say. I'm gonna like knock on wood and like do some sort of prayer or something like this, but I don't tend to have that problem with them. I grow all my trees organically, and I use very limited, very limited organic solutions at that. Like I use copper, I use neem oil. Um, that's about it. Like, and so I don't know. I've sort of think like if you use minimal amount, it makes the tree tougher, right? And then secondly, the other thing that I found is that generally if there's something wrong in the top of the tree, like 9 times out of 10, it's a problem with the root system, right? Or the problem with the soil that it's being grown in. So I do a lot of amendments, like when I plant trees, lots of mycorrhizal fungi, earthworm castings, azomite, like it's like weird, like everything that's going in there. But I find what it does is it makes the tree healthier, and then it has less problems later on. So yeah, and again, knock on wood that isn't the case.
Hey guys, maybe one more question. There's one.
I have a question about how does this sort of work? Do you take it home with you? Do you have like a home orchard, or are you so busy
yeah.
traveling that you can't really do
Yeah.
that?
No, I have so like in my backyard, what I have is what they call a mother block. A mother block is trees that have all been like tested for diseases or viruses that I can constantly watch, and there's probably there's a lot of trees. I don't know. There's like 40 or 50 trees on like a half acre, and those are the trees that I'll harvest branches from to take on these grafting trips with me. So yeah, and then I'll use others from the local area to kind of supplement those. But it's a small operation. Like it's all I need is like that much of a branch to graft to a tree. So it's Yeah, it works. Like I don't know, like I've had more than one occasion where it's interesting. Like, so where I gained all my knowledge about grafting was actually from orchardists that like generally their family didn't want to take it over, right? Take over the family business. So I would show up, you know, and talk to people and be like, I'm here to learn about grafting and I'm here to learn about fruit trees. And they're like, come here, my son, you know, like, you know, I'm adopted. And they're like, you're going to take over the business, right? And I'm like, no, I'm not taking over a business. Like, I do not like, I'm not interested in owning vast real estate. Like, that's just way too much maintenance. So I like the smaller scale of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.